This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 65 of the Photographing the West podcast, where twice a month we bring you interviews with interesting people doing interesting things. Today is no exception, as I have with me wildlife biologist and mountain lion expert Jim Williams. We're going to discuss his nearly 3 decades of experience with mountain lions in North America and South America, and his new book, Path of the Puma. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, Kirby.
Tell everyone about yourself and how your interest in mountain lions or pumas developed.
Well, it's a good question. It actually started in Southern California. I was a young man and very much spent a lot of time surfing on longboards in Pacific Beach. And at some point I got a mask and snorkel and took a peek beneath the waves and saw all the marine life and was inspired. And so I ended up pursuing a marine biology degree. I went to San Diego State and then eventually Florida State. Worked for the ocean world, the sea worlds, and wanted something more wild. So I applied to graduate school in Montana and came to Montana over 30 years ago and started working on mountain lions. And 30 years zips by and had a lot of adventures in South and North America, and in particularly Montana and the Northern Rockies. And that's how I ended up here.
Oh, I see. So mountain lions seem to go by a variety of names depending on geography. Are they all the same animal, or are there distinct species?
Yeah, that's a common question. And actually, they are all known as Puma concolor now in the scientific community. There are about 6 subspecies. So a cougar, catamount, panther, mountain lion, puma, they're all the same. There are 6 subspecies. We have one up here, and there's one in Patagonia, and there's 4 in between in South and Central America. And that is, they are separated by the new tools using genetics and DNA.
Are there differences between the subspecies, or are they all basically the same as far as most people are concerned?
Well, yeah, and you're right. For the most part, a cat's a cat, right? And the cats are a tad larger in the southern tip of Patagonia, and then, in the southern regions of Patagonia, which is, by the way, the southern portions of Chile, the southern portion of Argentina. And they're a little larger as you get north into Canada, just slightly, but most of the males are about 130 to 150 pounds, and females 80, 90, pushing 100. But behaviorally, they're quite similar, actually, from north to south.
I see. One of the interesting things in your book is a map showing the eastward expansion of mountain lions. I think many people would be surprised to see how many mountain lions are in the Midwest and the East, let alone in the mountains of the West. What's prompted that expansion?
Well, it's kind of a long story, and it's a success story in North America in particular. First, if you think about it, in the 1950s, 1940s, those were the wildlife restoration days for deer and elk, and it was a hunter-funded conservation model, and in this country, which has issues, but it's still the envy of the world in terms of funding wildlife work. And so deer and elk, we were recovered throughout the West, and that set the table because that's the grocery store for large carnivores, and in particular mountain lions. So in about the 60s, most of the people that had hounds that originally took lions for bounties in the 50s and 40s, started pursuing lions recreationally. And they saw value in having lions on the landscape, outside of, just killing them for bounties. So throughout the 1960s, bounties were eliminated in this country. And then in the 1970s, those same hound handlers, men and women, went to their state agencies in the West and said, we want to make game animals. And that's a big deal because once they're a game animal, you have game wardens in those states to enforce laws, and they're protected by law. And then in the 80s, the science came on board Dr. Hornacher in Idaho and others, had better science. If you're going to hunt cats or you're going to remove them for safety, here are the impacts. So it was the hound handlers, again, working with biologists in the States to manage lions a little bit better with the best science. So lions increased in the West and peaked in the mid-90s. And since then, we've seen a slow but steady recolonization of former mountain lion habitat pushing east from the west. And you think about those island ranges like the Black Hills in South Dakota, the Bighorns in Wyoming. You have, habitats, where lions are in Texas that these lions can move into. And typically males move first and they disperse further and right away from their natal area where they're born. And in this country, if you think about the West, these rivers drain west to east for the most part, or northwest to southeast. And they're typically forested along the water, even out in the prairie with cottonwoods. Those are perfect movement corridors. And then they'll intercept mountain ranges where lions have colonized. And those are kind of jumping off points. So the two covers on the front and back side of the book, they're the same. We really wanted to show where the sightings are showing up and some arrows of some possible direction of dispersal of mountain lions moving toward the Midwestern states. And that presents a whole nother set of issues with tolerance. And, are we going to allow them to stay there? But they're going to come, whether we want to or not, and primarily on the backs of white-tailed deer. That's what they're following.
So mountain lions and grizzlies are apex predators and seem to inspire both fear and admiration and interest in people. Why do you think that is?
Well, so we work a lot with grizzly bears here in Montana as well. We have over 700 bears in the Yellowstone system, and we're recovered in the Northern Continental Divide, at least from a biological perspective. In the recovery area, we have over 1,000 grizzlies growing at about 2% a year. So I deal with that a lot, in my job here as well. But for both mountain lions and bears, and wolves for that matter, they hold special places in Native American and Native peoples, folklore. They're a fellow hunter. They evoke a wild array of emotions in humans, whether it's sharks, lions, bears. We're wired to respond to that, and especially with the safety threat, recognizing that, driving in California or even Montana is far riskier than hiking with a native carnivore on the landscape. But we're hardwired to respond to that. And I think all of the names that mountain lions have, and they have many more names, by the native tribes, are a testament to, the place large carnivores had in our ancient societies as humans, and still today, people care.
So your book, Path of the Puma, seems to be a mix of personal anecdotes, the ecology of mountain lions, and ideas about mountain lion conservation. How would you describe your book, and how did you come to write it?
Yes, that's a tougher question to ask. Actually, I was in South America in Patagonia, what is now Patagonia National Park, and I was visiting you'll read about Christian Salcedo. He's a veterinarian in the park that works for Doug and Chris Thompkins. And I was staying with Doug and Chris in the park, and Doug Thompkins, who passed away, a few years ago in a tragic accident kayaking down there. But Doug and Chris together, having evening conversations after days in the field, Doug asked me when I was going to write my stories up. And I told him when I'm retired someday. And he kind of smiled and he said, well, you either are going to be an activist or you're an inactivist. You got to write them up. So it made me think. And it was kind of fun to kind of, tie a bow on, roughly 30 years worth of wildlife work and share my stories. And I really wanted readers, whether they were a young, surfer like I was in San Diego, or a young biologist or a photographer, in your case, to be able to travel in my shoes in these magical landscapes in the Northern Rockies and Chile and Argentina, and be able to kind of experience these conservation adventures. And some worked out well, some didn't, but they were good nonetheless. And I just wanted to share that to inspire, future biologists and people that care about conservation. Because let's face it, in today's digital world, you have an iPhone and a TV remote. who in the world is going to read a book unless it engages someone and tells stories people want to read? And that's what I tried to do. And Patagonia, the clothing company, was the publisher. They have a division called Patagonia Books. And since, you're a professional photographer for Kirby, they made the book a work of art in my mind, with beautiful works that many professional photographers contributed to, and some amateurs as well. And Patagonia is very visual in their books, and I really appreciate that as well, along with the maps. So hopefully the photographer component of your audience will enjoy those photos. They're just striking.
Yeah, I agree. They're beautiful photographs of mountain lions, or pumas as they're called down there. Mm-hmm. So, I especially enjoyed that part of the book, along with your stories, of course. So in your book, you advocate for public-private partnerships to preserve habitat for mountain lions and other megafauna. Well, that's the ideal. How well does this concept work in practice in your experience?
Yes. Okay, so it's a little different in Patagonia than it is up here, but they both involve public-private partnerships. So down there, I mentioned Doug and Chris Thompkins, and Doug and Chris, they have literally spent their personal accumulated wealth to buy ranches, convert them into parks throughout Patagonia, and they're doing it at a scale that is similar, in my mind, to what Teddy Roosevelt did in this country when the Forest Service and the public lands were created years ago. They're doing that right now in South America. They're rewilding these landscapes. They're hiring staff, building trails. They're building visitor amenities, and then they give them back to the government. Their own money has bought these conservation properties, and they give them to Chile. They gave them to Argentina, and it's working. And that's kind of a park model that's unique, but no one is, in my mind, doing what Chris Thompkins and Doug Tompkins have done in Patagonia, working real closely with Patagonia, the company. There was a very close relationship there. So that private-public partnership down there is just simply amazing. Up here, there are lots of private land trusts that conserve habitat, that agencies are working with tribes, federal, state. And the reason my book, there's two big themes. One is tolerance for large carnivores. It takes working in local communities and for those communities to tolerate these animals on the landscape. That's a big deal. It's up to us whether they're going to be here or not. And the other is habitat. And so, people argue about hunting or animal rights or removal of problem animals. They can argue all day long. But when it comes down to it, if there's no habitat, open space for these animals, they're not going to be here, and we're not going to have the luxury of having those philosophical debates. So I really emphasize to anyone who cares to support your local land trust, because subdivision of winter range of deer and elk, and that's the food for wolves and lions, and in part bears seasonally. They're more vegetarians. But subdivision and building homes on winter range is a permanent impact. And so land trusts in the West and in this country and in Canada now too just serve a vital role in conservation. So those are my two big themes, and those are all private-public partnerships. And I think in the future, those are just going to be strengthened.
So land trusts buy up private land and preserve them as basically wilderness for animals of all sizes and shapes, but they stay in the ownership of the trust, as I understand it in most cases. Is that true?
Well, yeah, in part they can do that, but another tool is called a conservation easement. So a large ranch owner, one of the private property rights is to work with a land trust and sell a conservation or donate a conservation easement to that land trust, and that prevents future subdivisions. It goes on the title that's recorded in the local courthouse. And a conservation easement is essentially part of the bundle of property rights that relates to subdivision, or some others can be sold or donated and protected permanently. And then the land trust can then work, very effectively on the landscape of which ranches and what areas they want to work with. But it's all voluntary by sellers.
Okay. For those who haven't read your book yet, talk a little bit more about who Chris and Doug are or were, as in Doug's case, I guess.
Yeah, so Doug Thompkins was an entrepreneur, and he created the North Face Company, as we know it. It's a very popular, outdoor gear company, and also Esprit Clothing, which was an international company. And Chris Thompkins, she was the CEO at Patagonia for years, and when they combined their energy and conservation zeal, magic happened, and they started, together buying these ranches in South America and converting them into parks. They believe that, parks are the gold standard in conservation, and that holds that they are. It's expensive. It's not many people can do it. They're doing it. They're doing it very effectively, and they're it's a model for the rest of the world to follow, really. And so Doug and Chris, again, have done on par what Teddy Roosevelt did in this country, in my mind.
They've bought up literally millions of acres of ranches, I guess, that have been converted to parks.
Yep, they're targeted because they're looking at habitats and wildlife species and landscapes. They weren't just willy-nilly on the landscape. They were targeted areas, from everyone from European mining conglomerates own pieces of land down there. There's an interesting history in land ownership, but they did a very targeted acquisition of habitats and species ranges in Patagonia. And again, like I said, they turn around, and Chris, is donating. Thompkins Conservation is her organization. They're donating those lands, giving them back to the governments of Chile and Argentina to be, parks for all Chileans, all Argentinians, and all visitors from now into the future. It's just incredible what they've done.
Yes, it is. Going back to your book, talk about the concept of rewilding as discussed in your book.
Yeah, rewilding is an interesting term. And so the way, it can be everything from, putting a bird feeder out on a flat in Manhattan and having birds coming and enjoying nature. That's actually, rewilding in a small part. And then the extreme is creating parks from ranches and reintroducing species that are missing, determining what is missing first, and then working to reintroduce, letting habitats heal from overgrazing or desertification, or taking down fences to make movement, free and open for wildlife again. Well, wildlife, all species need to roam to varying degrees. And so rewilding, there's a whole spectrum of activities, working with grazing systems, with agricultural landowners, replanting or recreating wetlands that were drained. So rewilding is essentially habitat management and people management in part as well. And then there's a component of rewilding that's in our hearts and minds, and that's one of the most important. And in my book, I really wanted to convey, if local communities don't support these projects, they will not be durable. They won't last. When biologists leave, they'll revert back. So this is where conservation gets messy. This is where biologists roll up their sleeves and work with local ranchers, and they work with local communities, often conservative, and have different values, whether it's up here or down there. And in order for the conservation programs to last, they have to be accepted. And that means a lot of coffee, fix and fence with cowboys on ranches up here often, or working with timber companies in the woods, or down there working with gauchos. That's their culture. The gauchos manage the huge sheep ranches in Patagonia. And the victories and the conservation projects take a long time to mature, and you have to be very patient. But those are the projects that are durable and they'll last. And that's in my mind, one of the most important parts of rewilding. It's the people and the hearts and minds.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. And I think traditionally, at least from my point of view, wildlife biologists have been more interested in conserving wildlife or protecting wildlife than they have with working with other groups of people to conserve them. So it's a great approach, I think.
I really wanted to share those stories in the book. And again, the book is almost more about people than it is about pumas and conservation adventures. But it's in my mind, in my career, that's what I found, after looking back, is that's one of the most rewarding and challenging parts of the job has been working with the communities. But again, it's so important.
I agree. Most photographers are familiar with the Torre del Paine National Park in Chile, but not Patagonia National Park. Are there ways to visit Patagonia National Park without having a local friend to show you around as you've had?
Yes. And actually, they're making it very easy. So it's a couple days to go down to Patagonia. It takes a couple days to get there. You're going to fly out of Texas, Seattle, LA, Atlanta, to hop down, most cases, to Santiago, Chile, and switch airlines. And then you're going to fly. There's a couple ways. You're going to land either at Balmaceda, which is the beginning, of an 8-hour drive on a gravel road to get to the park, or you can skip and fly over the park down near Torre del Paine and land, near Ushuaia, and there's some other, places you can land there. Not many, but either way, you're going to drive to the Chacabuco River Valley, and that's Patagonia National Park. They have now, they contracted with a young couple named called Maps for Good to create these beautiful park maps with trails and overlooks. And what's unique about, some of these Patagonia parks when it comes to big cats is that here they're really ghosts. Very difficult, as you know, to photograph them. They move at night, they move at dawn or dusk typically. But down there, if they're not persecuted by gauchos or killed to protect domestic sheep, in a few years, they start to move around out in the open, it seems. And some of my colleagues are just exploring that right now, where you can actually, follow them and take photos of cats, pumas, in the open as they chase their native prey, which is a wild camel called a guanaco. Looks like a llama. Those are their native. They evolved, for thousands of years. They did ancient dance of hoof and tooth with this wild camel and this puma down there. And photographers are now taking spectacular pictures. Now, it's a fine line when you can see them to getting too close. As you know, that gets into, there's a whole bunch of interest in photography when it comes to pumas because it's so rare. It's that they're doing research in the park in Torre del Paine right now. Mark Elbrock and Panthera working with partners in Chile to explore, what is the appropriate, distance, what are the impacts of following these cats around in the open. But it is a unique experience, Kirby, that you can, film either movie or stills of cats down there. And in Patagonia Park, of course, that's a new park. And cats are starting to be seen more in the open, but it's going to take time to be the same because they were persecuted as recently as, 20 years ago. And if a cat leaves that park, they still, in all likelihood, are going to be killed on a sheep ranch, potentially, if they're caught. So Patagonia Park is going to probably be similar to Torre del Paine. In my mind, the park is more diverse in landscapes. You got glaciers to that dry Argentina steppe leaking into Chile. You have this incredible diverse landscape down there. But yeah, you can self-guide, hike, photograph, enjoy that park. Beautiful maps. They have a website you can go to now with English and Spanish versions. So it takes a while to get there, but once you're there, it's you'll have a wonderful time. You just have to be prepared for the weather. I mean, after all, it is windy, cold Patagonia year round.
So is it possible to drive from Ushuaia to Patagonia National Park?
Yeah, there's a couple ways. There's some ferries you have to take. You can go through Argentina and come back in from Argentina to Chile, or you can fly into Balmaceda, which is up by Coyhaique to the north, and take this wonderful road. There's a chapter in my book called the Carretera Austral, that great southern highway. It's worth it to go down there just to drive that road. And if you're a photographer, you're not going to get there in 8 hours because you're going to stop at so many places if it's clear and take pictures of these unbelievable peaks and glaciers and lakes. It's an 8-hour drive where the plane lands to the north, up near Coyhaique, the town up north. It's a big fly fishing destination too. But that drive down, Kirby, if you're a photographer, you're probably going to take a couple days because it's just photographic opportunity after photographic opportunity of these magical landscapes that are just giant and vast. And then you can just they have parking areas and campgrounds And there's even a nice lodge down there with a restaurant. And recently, it's a brand new visitor center that they've opened in Patagonia National Park that's spectacular for visitors to kind of orient themselves with history, natural history, cultural history, and, maps of the park.
So there is some infrastructure to support visitors, I guess, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lodge. It's not, you have to pay to stay there, but it's beautiful. I mean, with Doug Thompkins and Chris Thompkins, they really have an eye for kind of the aesthetics, the art of the infrastructure in a park, whether it's a trail, a building. A lot of it reminds me of some of the historic lodges here in North America that are famous or that people love and are near and dear, with the historic architecture. It's just, it's mind-bogglingly beautiful, just the architecture of what they've done down there in Patagonia Park. So you can stay in the lodge. If you get on their website, you'll see the links.
Okay. Sounds like a great place to visit.
Yes.
Mountain lions are rarely seen and even more rarely heard about in the U.S. at least, unless they attack a human. Are there places or ways that they can be seen and safely photographed without injury to the photographer or the lion, without going to a game farm?
Yes, lions are very difficult to photograph in North America. They're one of the wildcats are the most difficult in my mind. I know people that are hardcore that can follow the tracks in the snow till they find a kill and then back off and conceal themselves. And if you can stay warm, that's your number one threat, is not freezing to death, and you're patient, that cat will come back if it's a fresh kill, a deer kill or an elk, to feed on it, and they get photos. And of course, now with the advent of camera traps, people are getting remote photos and remote videos all over where you don't have to spend the night sitting out there. And so the camera trap technology, these trail cams have kind of revolutionized, the ability to photograph and video cats in the wild. And in Argentina and Chile, again, in Patagonia, it's more open. Those landscapes are open and those cats are a little more visible. But up here, it's difficult. And, but it can be done. Now, in terms of safety, you're safe. Most cats, they watch you. We don't see them, but they see us. They're pretty much a non-issue. If we were part of the search image for prey, for a mountain lion, there'd probably be dead people everywhere, but we're not. They eat deer and elk, and they eat small mammals. Rarely do we have these attacks. I mean, the percentage is infinitesimally small. And again, you're far more at risk drowning in a park or getting struck by lightning or getting in a car accident. But so in terms of safety for humans, I wouldn't worry. Now, safety for the cat, you don't want to push it off to kill and affect its life history. So, but in terms of photographer safety, I wouldn't worry. Now, bears, whole different critter. You got to give them space. That's a whole different issue.
Yeah, especially up in your part of the country, I think. At least
yeah, we've had fatalities with photographers. We have photographers get killed. So grizzly bears are, you got to give them a lot of space. And there's you can read online all the tips, what to do with bears. But the bottom line is you don't want to surprise them, and you need to be a long ways away with a good lens. They are an apex predator, and they will defend their space.
Indeed. You wanted to discuss the ethics of wildlife photography. I suspect we might have slightly different points of view, but I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well, first off, I think, the two things that are often controversial are, captive facilities like zoos or marine parks, where there's a lot of human values placed on captivity, should wild animals be in there or not. And then the same thing with photographers getting too close to zoom lenses or no zoom lenses. But the bottom line is zoos and aquariums and, incredible wildlife photographs inspire people to care. There's great value there. It inspires conservation. But I think what's going on in Torre del Paine, there are so many photographers down there, and that's why Chile is doing research down there with Panthera. What are the limits when it comes to big cats? What are those spatial limits that photographers should abide by? And those answers are not concrete yet. That research is just getting going and being done. And we've had issues with people getting too close to bears. And clearly, you can pay the ultimate price if you do that up here. You can get killed by the animal. But it's a fine line between the freedom to enjoy and photograph for most park employees versus keeping the visitors safe. And so, it's a line that I think everyone's got in their own mind. And so that would be my thoughts on that. But I do and 100% support, photography inspires and video film inspires conservation. That's a great thing. How do you do that without affecting the life history of the animals you're photographing? That's typically the issue.
What are your thoughts on how photographers should approach wildlife, and what is a safe distance for the animal?
Well, for bears, it's all about the lens and common sense and hiking in groups and making noise to not surprise them, and using good lenses that you don't have to get close. There are times when you're going to be close to a bear accidentally, but giving them their space because they need it, or they will charge. Particularly a female with cubs, protecting their offspring. They're very protective. Bears are of their cubs. With cats, it's a fine line. They do a darn good job, and bears do too, at avoiding humans. They do. So when you do find a kill or a cat, they're going to let you know. A cat's going to hunker down if it's nervous, or it's going to walk away. I think it'll self-regulate a little bit. Photography for big cats is very, very difficult to begin with. And I think most photographers know that space. It's individual in nature too. It depends on the kill, where it's made, what the cat's doing. Are you in a car? Are you on a trail? I just think that's something a photographer is going to have, that ethical voice in their head that's going to tell them. But definitely with bears, stay a long ways away and use a long lens.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned when we were talking before about some episodes with what I guess would be best described as unethical photographers. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah. So what my colleagues in Chile and Argentina, I've heard lots of stories of people just pushing cats around, literally pushing them off their kills to get photographs, or trying to camp near them at night. And what that does, whether it's known or not, it's a process called habituation. When wild animals get used to people close by, they become habituated. They don't flee anymore. Normally they avoid people. Well, that's fine. Well, think about a cat down there. Then it leaves the park on a ranch, and it's not afraid of someone. They're going to get killed immediately by a gaucho on a sheep ranch. So indirectly, you contributed to the death of that animal by habituating it, or as a group of people habituating it when it leaves a park. Now up here in North America, when a cat's habituated in most states, it's taken out and killed, because the risk of, once an animal loses its fear of people, it's much more dangerous to take a child or a person, potentially, especially if it's a young cat that's not a real good hunter yet and is still learning. Habituated wolves, habituated lions, habituated bears, they're typically killed and pulled out of the population. It's not a population issue typically, but still, people contribute to the death of that animal either by human attractants or habituation. So as a photographer, you got to think in your mind, am I training that animal to accept me, or am I photographing it from a distance that I'm not a factor in that habituation process? So I think that's, each individual photographer needs to think about that.
Right. But before we go, where can people find out more about you, your book, and mountain lions in general?
Well, I'd love to hear, your comments. So there's a website that they set up called pathofthepuma.com, and you can email me there. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the book and the photos. You have a large circle of photographers, and I think the photographs in this book are just amazing. And Jane Sievert and Jennifer Ridgway have done the Patagonia catalogs for 30 years. They did the photos in the books with a part of a larger team of help, of course, but they just made it beautiful, like those clothing catalogs. And I'm curious to see what the photographers think about the photos, and the conservation messages. Hopefully it inspires people, to care a little more and get involved with, tolerance issues in communities and habitat conservation with your land trusts. I hope that people do. And thanks for your time. Time is precious, and reading books to me is important. I value it. So hopefully, your audience does as well, and hopefully you enjoy it.
So what's the website for your book?
It's called pathofthepuma.com. One word, pathofthepuma.com.
Okay. Easy enough.
Yep,
Well,
and
thanks.
there's a contact toggle. Yep.
Thanks, Jim, for some great information about mountain lions, a subject that fascinates a lot of us, but that most of us know a little about. Be sure to check out the show notes for more information about Jim, his work, and his book at www.flanaganphotos, spelled FLANAGANPHOTOS, all one word, .com. Bye for now, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.